Hello and welcome to Stratford Chef School Open Kitchen at Home with Chef Eli, where today we'll be looking as to how to make slow fermented pizza at home. The full recipe and methodology should be listed in a link provided. Here we're looking at the ingredients and we'll be beginning with our poolish. Our poolish is our pre-ferment that we'll be using to kickstart the flavor development and the yeast activity. We'll be starting by combining 220 grams of flour with a pinch of yeast and 220 grams of cold water. We're going to be mixing this loosely with the spatula and then moving it into a container, which will allow it to expand at least 3 times in size. We'll leave it at room temperature for anywhere from 10 to 16 hours, allowing it to expand in size until we see a high water mark and show that it's starting to recede on itself. The warmer the environment, the quicker this will occur. Ensure that we are using a jar or container large enough. We want to have it narrow to prevent surface area, but allow for expansion at the same time. So after this is fermented anywhere from 10 to 16 hours and we see that it has hit its high water mark, we can move into the mixing of the bread. We're going to be using a stand mixer here. You can do this by hand, but it is much easier to do in a stand mixer with a dough hook. So here we see that pre-ferment nice and bubbly. We're going to be measuring off 550 grams of warm water. It's much easier to get a large amount of water warm and then measure off the desired amount rather than trying to measure and get the same temperature at the same time. So we're going to be adding our dry ingredients, the flour, the cornmeal, and the yeast. We want to mix that a bit before adding the salt because we don't want salt to be in directly contact with the yeast, as it does have the potential to kill it. At this point, we're going to be adding in all of our poolish or pre-ferment. We'll scrape out the sides using a spatula, but then use the residual warm water that we've measured off in order to get everything out of that pre-ferment jar. We're going to move this into the stand mixer with that dough hook attachment. We have everything in here except for the oil in the recipe. We're going to be turning this on to speed 1 and be mixing this from anywhere from 2 to 3.5 minutes until all of this is incorporated. We're going to show this process at a bit higher speed, keeping in mind that this is on level 1 just to incorporate the ingredients. Here this is still on speed 1. I'm just showing the process to show how the dough develops and starts to bring and cling the edges off the sides of the bowl until we start to get a bit of a smooth, elastic, and shininess develop to the dough. So we just slowed it down. Again, this is still on speed 1 on the lower mixing. We want to develop the gluten at this stage before we start incorporating the oil slowly. So at this stage, we're going to start slowing it down, showing the progress as it completes the mixing on stage 1. And here we're going to be stopping the process and starting to move to stage 2. So once we've had all the ingredients nicely incorporated, we see that that interior bowl is fully clean. We're going to increase the speed to stage 2 and start adding the oil very slowly. It is important that we add the oil drip by drip. If we add an excess amount of oil in the bottom of the bowl, it's just going to pool and the dough will slosh on top of it rather than incorporate in. So we need to go drip by drip. We're going to be mixing on speed 2 for approximately 2 minutes, and it should take nearly the entire full first minute to get that oil in there. After that, we're simply bringing the dough back together. We can add a bit more of loose flour if necessary, but it should come together on its own simply through mixing on speed 2. So here we see that the oil is fully integrated. It's not going to be too much more mixing from there, and what we're going to do is just have it come together, and then we're going to be removing it from the bowl. After mixing, we're going to slightly just shape it with our hands to smooth these rough jagged edges that might be protruding off of this after it comes out of the bowl. So we're just going to do a light kneading with our hands on a barely even floured surface. We don't want to incorporate any more loose flour at this point. We're just smoothing the edges, at which point we move it into a lightly oiled or greased container. I'm using the same garlic oil that we've used in the recipe. So what we're going to be doing here is just checking that we do have that elasticity or gluten development. If we were mixing this dough by hand, it's that same spring back that we'd be looking for as an indicator to stop mixing and start the bulk fermentation. So at this stage, we're going to cover the bread, move it into the same temperature, room temperature environment, and allow it to proof for 45 minutes. It's a full 1 hour and a half or 90 minutes. We're going to be folding, which is what's being demonstrated at this stage. So a light amount of flour goes down. At the halfway mark or 45-minute mark, we're going to be removing the dough out from the container carefully. We're going to be folding all 4 edges in on itself and then placing it back inside the container in the new seam side down. By doing this folding rather than the punching mechanism that we'd be seeing something like the Joy of Cooking, we're doing several processes. We're strengthening the gluten development of the dough, we're degassing it, and we're also regulating temperature, which is a bit warmer on the inside through this microbial activity of fermentation. So once we've loosely just brought these four edges in on themselves, turned it on its over, we're going to put that seam side down, just press it down, cover it back up, and continue that second stage of the bulk fermentation for the other 45 minutes, taking to an hour and a half in the bulk fermentation stage. Once this is done, we're going to be moving into the division. So after our bulk fermentation is complete, we'll be moving into dividing the dough. This recipe yields 2 kilograms or 8 equal pieces at 250 grams. If you want to estimate and just cut it into 8 equal pieces, you can do that. For best results, you want to be ensuring that they're each 250 grams, which requires you weighing. Notice that I am taking one strip off. When we are taking these to uniform weights, we want to be doing this in as large a size a piece as possible. The last thing we want to be doing is trying to amalgamate 40 small pieces into one batch of dough and expecting great results. This is fermented, so we do have some aeration in this. We want to keep this as best as possible, even though it will be a bit deflated through our pre-ferment process. So once we have this equally divided into 8 equal pieces, we're going to be moving into that pre-shaping stage. This is going to be similar to a bun formation. We're going to be bringing in all edges on itself and just tightening this by pulling it in towards its center axis on a non-floured table. Notice that there is no flour on this. If there was, it'd just be scooting on top rather than drawing tension and creating this tightening principle effect. So we don't need to be too strong here. We're just giving this a pre-shape, at which point we're going to rest it for approximately 15 minutes covered so we can allow that shaping to get instigated, but also allow that gluten to relax before we move into the final shaping. So here we see the last of the 8 just being put aside, again keeping them covered during the 15-minute bench rest. The final shaping is going to repeat the same process that we've seen before, minimal flour on the table, tightening this up, then moving on to a parchment-lined tray. We're going to see 2 different principles to do after we've done this final shaping, where we can use it right away, in which case we would not be brushing with oil, or a slow fermentation where we move it into the fridge covered, in which case we are going to be brushing it very lightly with oil as seen here. We're going to complete the final shaping with the remainder 8 of the doughs. We're going to lightly brush them with oil, and then we're going to cover them in that wrap and move them into the fridge from anywhere from 4 to 16 hours. If you do not want to do this, you can move right into the assembly of your pizza dough by omitting this oiling and covering principle and moving right into the rolling and topping. So here we see this process. We have actually used the bread that has been retarded, so we've taken it out of the fridge for 10 to 15 minutes just to get a bit room temperature, and now we're going to start the shaping process. There's really 2 schools of thought and a hybrid involved here. You can either do it all by your hand or a rolling pin. I tend to use option 3, which is the hybrid. I'm going to be starting with a rolling pin very early on, then I'm going to be using my hands in a combination of pulling out from a centrifugal center axis and then also allowing the pizza to lift off the table as I pull and stretch it. Notice that half the weight of the pizza, especially as it gets thinner, is on the board. I don't have everything holding up, and I'm going back and forth between this combination of having my fingers in the center and stretching them out and lifting the dough off the table. This is a bit of a laborious process. We don't want to overwork the dough here. It is going to take anywhere from 2 to 3 minutes to get this nice and stretched out as it continues to come up to temperature and stretches delicately. It is important that we aren't too aggressive. We don't want to tear or rip the pizza, which would render it very hard to dress and get off of our peel, which is the next step in the process. So get this as thin or as thick as you'd like. That really comes to your preference, whether you want super thin or focaccia-like. Once we have the pizza dough rolled out, we're going to move it into onto a peel or an inverted tray, and then lightly coat it with cornmeal to prevent it from sticking. We're going to be dressing this with whatever toppings you'd like. We see a variety in the pizza class that we offer through our Open Kitchen in-class format. Once you have some toppings on, ensure that we're shimmying the pizza so that it isn't sticking to that board, so that we are able to take it off when we move it into the oven next. Here we're going to be seeing two different examples. We have a pizza on a tray already, and then we have a pizza moving from the peel onto an inverted baking sheet. We have this in there because the baking sheet can get hot. It's inverted so that we don't have to deal with the lips after the pizza has been baking. Here we see the same principle by taking it off of the peel onto a preheated pizza stone. Keep in mind that if we are using a pizza stone, it needs to start in a cool oven and come up. Halfway through the baking process, we can remove it off of their respective trays and move onto either a perforated baking sheet or onto the oven racks directly to allow them to cook underneath without being steamed. Here, when they're done, we see them on a perforated rack. Lastly, we see a cut piece which is able to hold itself in toppings on its own. It is still pliable and bendy enough to fold on itself. Enjoy!